Well, just like TryCatch ladder, we also have nested TryCatch block in exception handling. So to understand that, let us assume that this white block is basically represent the try block and the color one will represent the catch blocks. So whenever there is an exception in the try block, it go to the corresponding catch block and the exception is been handled. So how to construct the nested try catch block? Let's start with a try block. Let's assume that this try block may have an arithmetic exception. So what is the immediate thing we need to do? Well, we need to include a catch block which is able to handle that arithmetic exception. So what if we put this try catch block within a try block itself and assume that this outer try block may have an array index out of bound exception. So we need to include a catch block which is able to handle the array index out of bounds exception. Now what is the purpose of that? Now remember, we talked about this args in TryCatch ladder. So if we don't pass any value to it from the command prompt, what happens? It leads to an array index out of bound exception. Now suppose we put that instruction here within the try block. So if we put that instruction here within this outer try block, that means now this outer try block have this instruction and the overall try catch block, where the inner try block is only able to handle the arithmetic exception, but not this args, because that is not in here. And even if we put this args 0 in the inner try block, still the exception is unsolved or unhandled, because this try block has only one catch block and that is able to handle only arithmetic exception, not any other type of exception. So if we put this particular instruction outside that inner try block or inside that inner try block, in both the cases we have an exception which is basically array index out of bound exception. So to handle that exception, we bring another catch block for this outer try block, and now this catch block is able to handle that exception because this catch block is take an object of array index out of bound exception as a parameter. Well, just like a try block can have a try catch block, similarly a catch block also have a try catch block. So now let's assume this catch block has a try block where there is a chance of number format exception, so it has a try catch block with this. So if we go like this further, we can create several nested try catch block as per as our requirement. So here we have the outermost try block which is able to handle all type of exception, because this catch block takes exception object. So it is basically the generalized form of exception, so it can handle any type of exception. And that outermost catch block also have a try catch block which is able to handle only the null pointer exception. So let's see how the exception actually will handle in that nested format. So to do that, let's assume that this innermost try block have an exception which is arithmetic exception. So it will immediately throw an object of arithmetic exception, and Java will try to consult with its corresponding catch block, and this catch block is able to handle that arithmetic exception. So from that catch block this exception has been handled. Now what if the same inner try block now have array index out of bound exception? Well, it will also consult with its own catch block, and now this time that catch block fails because this catch block is only able to handle arithmetic exception. So actually from that middle try block we have an unsolved object of array index out of bound exception. So now this try block has its own catch block, and that catch block is very much able to handle array index out of bounds exception. So now for array index out of bound exception, from this middle catch block the exception is been handled. Again, if there is a number format exception in this particular try block, it will consult with its own catch block and fails. Now the middle try block will then consult with its corresponding catch block, which actually takes array index out of bounds exception as a parameter. Now look that this middle catch block has another inner try catch block, and that inner catch block is able to handle number format exception. But can this catch block is able to handle the number format exception? No. Why? Because to enter into this catch block we need an object of array index out of bounds exception, but now we have an object of number format exception. So Java or the exception cannot be handled in this catch block. So overall, from this outermost try block, now we have this number format exceptions object, and which can be handled the outermost catch block, because here this catch block is able to handle all type of exceptions. So for this number format exceptions, the exception is handled from outer catch block, not from the inner catch block under the middle catch block. Similarly, if we have an exception or any general exception apart from arithmetic, array index, number format or null pointer, then it will first consult with its own catch block, then it will consult with the very next or the middle catch block, and finally that exception is handled in the outermost catch block. For null pointer exception, it goes as same as the previous. Now what if we have a null pointer exception here in the inner try block within the outermost catch block? Now this try block has its own null pointer exception. So it will consult with its own catch block, and that exception is handled from this point. Now what if we have some other exceptions apart from null pointer exception in that inner try block under the outermost catch block? Now this time the try block under the outermost catch block has its corresponding catch block, which is only able to handle null pointer exception. But here our exception or the generated exception is any other exception apart from the null pointer exception. Now this time this catch block fails to handle this exception, and here we have no more TryCatch structure. So what happened? So ultimately the exception or whatever the exception will created, generated, that is remain unhandled, and therefore the system stops its execution from that point. So this is how an exception is handled within a nested TryCatch structure. So let's see a code to understand it a little more better. So this is our nested TryCatch structure. So we have a corresponding code for that. Well, here our main class have a method f, which is as same as previous, but there is only one tiny change, that now this time instead of showing x divided by x minus 5, it will give you the output of x divided by x plus 5. We have the main method also. So under the main method, we create a str string type of variable and set it or initialize it as null. Now this is basically the innermost try block. So this is the innermost try block. Now innermost try block now have few instructions. What are the instructions? So we have a if-else structure over there. So the condition of the if is args dot equals 5. That means when we try to execute the code, if we pass 5, it becomes equals. And if it is equals, it will try to compare the value of args with str. Now here the str is null. So you and the args have a value. So at this point there is an exception will occur. What is that exception? That exception will be null pointer exception. Why it will occur? Because we basically str set as null. And if we pass anything apart from 5, this condition will fail and it will go to else. And first it will convert the value to int. Now here another chance of exceptions. So if we send f instead of 5 or 6, then there will be an exception, that is the number format exception. We already know how the number format exception can occur. Now if we send 5, then there will be no problem, but if we send 6, then there will be no problem, but if we send minus 5 here, then at this point there will be no exception occurred. So this x will then get minus 5 for this, and finally it becomes 0 at this point, and again there is a chance of exception, and that is arithmetic exception at that point. And if we don't pass any value, it will generate an array index out of bounds exception. So this is the overall code. So let's now look at the output and try to understand that code. Well, so this is the output of that. Now let's look that which catch block is handling which exception at which point. So when we call Java main, so obviously we won't pass any value, so we have an array index out of bound exception. At which line? So at this line we have an exception which is an array index out of bound exception. Now as we learn that this try block is not have the corresponding catch block which able to handle the array index out of bound exception, from this try block to this outer try block, the exception goes here. How? Because we have this output here. So for this exception, it's handled in this catch block. But for the second, when we send 5, so when we have 5, it will try to do this comparison, and there is an exception, but now it's not able to handle here, it's not able to handle here. So finally this exception goes here. So we have this. So this null pointer exception handled in this catch block. For AE or arithmetic exception, it's very much able to handle at this point, at this catch block, and similarly for F, it will again go to this outermost catch block. So this is